I do forget. We're going to start with one of the videos from Adopt Us Kids. I like to start with them just because it's good to hear from people that have adopted. They talk about why they adopted, what their thought process was. And again, I try to give you a balance because what you're going to be seeing in your therapy work and probably in your GAO work are the ones that haven't worked all that well or that are challenged, that have some difficulties. But it is good to know that there are good ones out there. So well, and I always like to start with those when we get going. Now I need to see if I can get the right family. I think I'm looking for the Mitchell family. Let me try.
I don't think we ever sat down and blueprinted what our family would look like ultimately, because if we had, it probably would have scared us half to death. We worked into it gradually.
What motivated us to become foster parents is my husband had actually lived in a foster home for a while. And after we got married and had a couple of our own, we agreed that if we were going to have any more children, that we would take in kids that needed foster homes. And together we just agreed that that was the direction that our family would go.
She started wanting another baby. So we revived that idea of becoming foster parents. And that's when we began the process that started 19 years ago. And, you know, as I said, we started with with one baby. And of course, starting with a baby is easy. You know, they're cute and cuddly and fun. But as it progressed and we became attached to the kids, then adoption just became the natural progression. It was just the right thing to do. And we couldn't have done it any other way because you become very attached to a child. And have we had to give a few up? Yes, we've had to say goodbye to a few, and it's always difficult. It's always challenging. I would say it's almost like a death in the family. When you've had a child for a year, for example, we had one that came to us at 3.5 and left at 4.5. And we knew she wasn't going back to a better situation than she had come out of. And that was difficult. But you get used to it. It's hard to say that you get used to it because you don't ever really get callous to it. But you know that it's part of what you do. But to build our family through adoption was just something that became a natural progression. Once you've had a child for a year, 2 years, that child becomes part of your family. And for us, I think we may have approached it a little bit differently than some foster families do. We've always had a policy that when a child comes in our home, they're family until the day they leave. We don't treat them as foster children. We treat them as our kids. They go to church with us. They eat meals with us. They go on vacation with us. And we simply could not do it any other way. So for us, adoption just kind of happened, you know. We didn't really plan it that way, but that's the way it has happened. And now, of course, we do plan it that way. We've had a lot of fun experiences. When you have 6 kids under the age of 12, and you go to a restaurant, you get some interesting comments, especially when they're multi-ethnic. We've had people come up to us and say, "You must be a daycare." And we say, "Yeah, days, nights, weekends." We've had people come up and ask, "Are you a church youth group?" You know, as the kids got older, about half of it.
Yeah.
So we've had a lot of fun experiences, a lot of interesting comments from people. And we sort of evolved toward teenagers because we had teenagers. And it was easier to take teenagers since we had teenagers.
Adoption has meant a lot, just watching like my parents, I guess, more or less giving themselves to kids that don't, you know, deserve more, but they can't get it from their first families. And for me, it's mean just having someone just taking you for who you are and accepting you and just you know, giving everything of themselves to be, you know, just like your first family.
Have we faced some issues? Yes, we've had a lot of issues that we've had to deal with. We have taken in a teenager with a brand new baby. And that's interesting to raise a child who's raising a child.
So I got moved to the maternity group home, and at that I stayed there until I had Alicia, and then they had another placement for me, and at that home I stayed there for 2 weeks, and the lady she was having some. It wasn't with me because she didn't say it was with me. She said she had some issues that she had to deal with, but I went to court one day and I came back and she put all my stuff on the front porch and told me they had to put me somewhere else. So then after that I moved here. So I came here as a foster child with my daughter into this family, and they accepted me, and they loved on me and my daughter. It's hard for a mom and a daughter to stay together. So, yeah. If I hadn't come here, then my daughter and I might have been separated. Because it was always hard finding a place for somebody to take me and my daughter, because nobody wanted to take me. So I remember the day that I got put out of that house, it took like all day for me to find another place for me, and because they called like several people and nobody would take me. So just because I had a daughter, and because it's a hard place too at the same time. So yeah, so if somebody never had opened up their heart to take me and my daughter, we could have been separated, and that would have been I can't picture my life without her, so that would have been really hard.
For us, it has been an incredible experience to watch the teenage mom grow up as a child herself and as a teenager herself, but also as a mom, and to begin to demonstrate the care and the responsibility that a mom needs to have of a child. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been very rewarding.
And we get a grandbaby.
That's right.
It's
2 for 1.
They take you in for who you are, no matter what you've done or how your past has been, and they just make you part of their family.
Felt normal, like these kids say, we came in here and mom and dad made us feel like we're home. Well, they're home. How can you send them anyplace else?
It's a risk. You have no guarantee that that child is going to end up being perfect. In fact, you pretty much have a guarantee they won't end up being perfect, but then you have a good guarantee that your birth children won't end up being perfect either. So, if we waited until the situation was right to decide to adopt, we'd probably never do it. It is something where you step out in faith and you do it. And do you get your nose bloody once in a while? Yeah. But the end result is that that child's life is changed. I think what we're looking for right now is we're looking for, it's almost ready to come full circle for us. We have older kids who I think very soon, one of them's married already and has kids, but we think that very soon some of our children will begin to do the same thing that we do. And when that comes full circle, then that's gratifying. For parents who are thinking about fostering, I would recommend you get to know some people who are doing it. I think that's the best way to really get a good view of what it's like, but you'll never get the best view until you do it yourself. And again, it's one of those things that's a leap of faith. You jump in, you do it. Are you always going to have enough money? No. Is your house going to be big enough? No. Is your car going to be big enough? No. You keep moving up. We started in a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house and moved from there to a 4-bedroom house. And we've had to keep moving up. We've started in a little tiny car, and now we have a 15-passenger van, Where does it come from? We don't know. We live by faith day by day. But it's something where we just jumped in, decided that we were going to do it. And now 19 years later, we look back, we're seeing the results of it. And again, we would not change course. Would we?
No, we wouldn't. And
Not today anyway.
and we don't consider ourselves saints. People look at you and tell you that you must be a saint to be able to do this. I'm not a saint. I'm just, you pray and using God's strength, and I'm blessed beyond measure with the children that have come into my home.
If you're thinking about taking, and a kid in, not necessarily to adopt them, but just to help out, don't worry about the money, don't worry about the beds and whatever you need. Just, worry about the love that you need to give to them, and, because the money and everything, that'll come and that'll go, but the love that you need to give to them will remain in their heart forever.
There's kids out there that need you to adopt them, and they need to be loved, and they need to feel like they're needed. Because if they just keep moving around foster home, that's not doing anything for them. And once they grow up, they won't have that family setting in them, and they'll be missing something.
We get about 5 standard responses from people when we tell them what we do. The one we get most often is, I could never do what you do. And the truth is, you can. You know, we did. Then we hear people say, you must be really special people. And the truth is, we're not. We just made a decision to do it. And what other things do we hear?
How can you afford it?
How would it affect my birth children? Yeah, that's a big concern that people have. Are they going to get them dirty or something, you know? Does it affect your birth children? Yeah, it does. It has affected ours tremendously. They are more able to interact with people. They have better people skills. They're more patient. They're better leaders. They're better at caring for their own kids. I can't think of any downside in terms of how it has affected our birth children. And now it's not so much about what we do, it's more who we are. Because this is what we're about. This is our mission in life. And we're pretty passionate about it.
I'd say to parents that are afraid to adopt, it's normal to be afraid, but it shouldn't be that much of a deal, because God tells us to give of ourselves to people that are less fortunate and just to be like Him to children that don't have families. And I'm just saying, you got to do it, because that's what you're here for.
I always find those people interesting because, hold on, let me move this. Because as we look at these different families that I'm showing you, they do all have a commonality. They all have a strong spiritual side. Now, do you have to have that to be successful? No, you don't, but these people do. They talk about having some kind of a guiding force or a higher power or whatever you want to call it that has given them the strength to do what they do. I'd like to say that some of the things that these kids talk about don't happen anymore, but they do. When the girl with the baby talks about coming back from court and finding her stuff on the front porch, that is something that does happen. It doesn't happen often, and we don't want it to happen. And certainly, the case management and licensing and placement people really work hard to avoid that. But there are times that it does happen. When the girl said it wasn't my fault, she didn't say it was my fault, but it was her stuff that was on the front porch without warning, and then having to find a place to put her because she had a baby. I think Charmaine mentioned the unwed mothers' homes, and one of the first times that we were all together, those things don't exist anymore. The whole mother and baby home, there are a few, but not very many. And when a teenager has a baby, they very often are separated because people don't want to take on that role of managing a mother and a young mother and a baby. So it's a difficult thing, but it is not uncommon for kids to experience what these two kids talked about. So, but again, these are the successful adoptions. These are the adoptions where you heard the father say people make odd comments to them when they're in restaurants. I've heard that very often from adoptive families when they have a big group, especially if it's a multiracial group. And people will come up to you and say things that you would never imagine saying to a stranger, like, are you a group home? Or do you run a daycare center? Or who are all these kids? We find it incredibly easy to be intrusive sometimes. And these are people that take it with a certain amount of a grain of salt, if you will. But we often don't get the experiences or the reactions from the general public that we wish we would if we are adopting. So, but that's what I find interesting about them. I find it interesting that they've been able to tap into their spiritual side, and they've been able to find a sense of humor about the things that have happened to them. So, so this is module 3. We're just going to go, you're going to find some of this is going to start to repeat, and I hope it repeats in a good way because I want you to remember it. But we're going to talk about just some of the things that affect the core issues. Again, we're back to the core issues of adoption. We're going to talk about what tasks adoptive children have to accomplish in order to be in the adoption world. We're going to talk about the tasks the parents have to accomplish. We're going to look at some of the clinical issues of adoption. We're going to talk a lot today about search because search is a really big part of this. And fortunately, we've had some movies that have depicted it rather well that allow us to kind of look at the way Hollywood looks at this stuff. But we're going to talk a lot about why kids search and why it is important for adoptive parents not to be frightened by that and to help them when they reach that stage. And they will. I honestly, and maybe some of you, as you go through your careers, will meet children that say, I don't want to know who my birth parents are. I have honestly never, ever had that experience. The experience that I have most typically had is that you get to be a little bit older and you're looking at your hair and your skin and your eyes and the fact that you can draw or the fact that you're good in sports or any of the things that make you you, you begin to say, where did I come from? That's just human nature. That's natural. It's very frightening for a lot of adoptive parents. So we are going to spend a fair amount of time on that today. Okay, some of the key themes that we are going to look at today is that, and again, always keep this in mind when you're talking to adoptive parents, is that adoption is a lifelong event. It's a lifelong journey. It isn't just the day you go to court and get the teddy bear and the judge takes your picture and everybody's happy. It's different for children and for parents, but it's lifelong. It's a lifelong journey. And anything that's lifelong is going to have its ups and downs. And the fact that adoptive families have issues does not mean that there's anything wrong with their adoption. When we say the word normative, we use normative over and over again when we're talking to our adoptive families to say there's nothing wrong with your adoption. There's nothing wrong with your family. These are normal issues that come up anytime you're trying to integrate different people into a family. It just means you have to predict them. The best way to deal with any problem is to predict that it's going to happen and plan for it when it does. So that's what we do. We predict, prepare, and get people ready for them. But it's going to happen. You're going to have issues in an adoptive family, the same way you'd have issues in your birth family. As you heard that man say, there's no guarantee that these kids are going to be perfect. There's no guarantee that the birth children are going to be perfect. Doesn't mean that the adoption is less than. And we always incorporate a family systems approach. Our therapists are very frequently asked to just go see this kid in school. And if you just go see this kid in school, you're not going to be able to really help the family where they really need help. Adoptive families need help integrating and attaching and forming into a family unit, because that doesn't happen instantly. So we always use that family systems approach. And we always try to say to them, there is going to be a certain amount of grief. It's a normal part of the process, and we're going to help you deal with it, because grieving isn't fun, is it? It's not fun. It's sad. It makes you feel bad, but it's a normal part of what you have to get through to bring these kids into your home and for these kids to come into your home. So we're going to help them deal with the normal part of grief, because there is a normal part. So our therapeutic approach is this: we're going to normalize, we're going to validate and support them. We're always going to use family systems, because this is a family problem and it's a family strength that we're working on. We're going to always use strength-based interventions. We don't want the adoptive family to kind of focus on what's, quotes, wrong with this child. And the adoptive parent has got to be a part of the treatment team. We had a situation here actually this week with, well, the person who reached out to us was a professional person. She was in the helping professions herself and had adopted a child and was having difficulties facing the normal stuff that goes on with kids. And she really didn't want to reach out because, you know, we're all helping professionals and we're the worst ones at trying to ask for help for ourselves. So she kind of first called and said, well, I have this client, and kind of beat around the bush. And eventually it became very clear that she was talking about an issue she was having with her own child. So one of the things, and whether or not she'll ever come back, I don't know. But one of the things that I talked to her about is the fact that all adoptions have this. Just because you're a helping professional, just because you're a therapist or a minister or a doctor or any one of the helping professions, it doesn't mean that these kids are going to come into your home and you're going to have no issues at all. All we need to do to help you is to normalize those issues and prepare and predict how we're going to deal with them. So I hope she does come back, because I often find that the helping professionals have a really hard time getting help for their own stuff. And let's face it, you know, when I talk about teachers adopting, therapists adopting, nurses adopting, the people that are in helping professions tend to be the ones that adopt. And then, because that's really where your mind and your body is anyway. But then when things don't go perfectly, they're also the ones that have a hard time reaching out for help. So we have some common beliefs and fallacies that we look at, and believe me, you're going to hear them from your adoptive families too. That these are very common belief systems that people who adopt kind of adopt, thinking that these are real, that there's no difference between being born into a family and being adopted. There's a huge difference. That's why we're doing this training. This isn't a training for how to bring your birth child in. This is a training for how do you integrate a child who has been traumatized, neglected, abused, gone through terrible things. How do you integrate that child? So, is there a difference? There's a huge difference. It doesn't mean that it's a bad difference. It just means that you can't pretend that it isn't different. Another common fallacy is that once you tell the child she or he is adopted, there you go, everything's fine. Which brings up another point, and I don't know what your experiences have been, but I don't know if any of you have worked with families who have not told their children that they are adopted. We have less and less of that issue now because we spend a lot of time educating people, but we have had situations where kids are adopted at a very young age and the families don't want to tell them. And I just want you to think about that for a minute. If you are 12 or 13 and suddenly your parents sit down and say to you, you know what, honey, you're not our birth child, you're adopted. That's a huge problem. That's a huge problem for the child. That's a huge problem for the parents. And trust me, once the kid knows he or she is adopted, the issue is not resolved. Um, think about your own children or you when you were a child. You probably had pictures around the house of you as a baby. Your mother probably had photo albums of you as a baby. You probably had different pictures in your brownie uniform or your Girl Scout uniform or whatever. Um, one of the things one of the families that we work with who finally did tell their 13-year-old that he was adopted, almost always the kids always know because, and they'll say, I never saw any pictures of myself when I was a baby. My mother didn't have anything around the house, or she didn't talk about things that happened when I was a baby. And I began to realize that I didn't look like her, or I didn't look like my father. So I always suspected that I was adopted. Now, where do you think the problem might be if you suddenly spring that on your 13-year-old? What is your child going to think you've been doing to them for 13 years?
Lying.
Yeah, lying to them, right? Because you have. Um, it doesn't come up as much in therapy with our families as it used to, but it does still come up. And especially if the child is very young when they come into the family. And it's always a problem. It's a problem to hide it. It's a problem to lie about it. And this is when the search becomes really, really difficult. That if you have hidden something like this from your child, all the more reason for them to get obsessed about who they came from. So there's really, I cannot think of a valid reason for not telling your child that he is or she is adopted. Anytime that we have had it, it has been a problem. In one situation, it was a 13-year-old boy. They had adopted him when he was I think he was 18 months old. And then they had a younger child that they had adopted, another boy. They were unrelated. But this child had pretty serious behavioral problems. And the therapist came in for the first session and they sent him to his bedroom and they sat in the living room. And we're not talking a massive house here. They sat in the living room and proceeded to tell the therapist that he's adopted, but they hadn't told him yet. Now, I don't know if they thought he was deaf or they thought that he wasn't listening at the door because this was the first time that this therapist had been there. And it was a very difficult case because he was a behavioral issue. A lot of his issues came from the fact that he knew he wasn't. He knew he was adopted, and he knew that they were lying to him because they're telling a perfect stranger in the living room. He's in the other room. I doubt that was the first time they'd ever brought it up. So there's just really not a good valid reason to withhold that information. And love is grand, but love is not enough. Love coupled with knowledge about attachment and what happens and what has happened to these kids and how they're affected by their trauma, that might be enough. But love is a wonderful thing, but it isn't enough. We also talk about families formed by adoption are second best. I think that things like people walking up to you in a restaurant and saying, are you running a daycare center here? Or is this a group home? Really makes people feel like their adoptions are second best, that they aren't a real family. People feel free to walk up to them, and that's not uncommon, and say, who are all these kids? They don't look like you. And that's difficult for adoptive parents. They can get some really negative messages from just the general public. Or the adoptive child who hears, aren't you lucky that this wonderful family adopted you? Aren't you lucky? Meaning you had nothing to do with it, and they were just wonderful and they brought you in. There's a lot of, well, what did we call them when we did the racial trauma, the microaggressions? We talk about microaggressions. There's a lot of microaggressions that go on by well-meaning people who don't mean to give you such a slanted view of how they see you, but they do. And is it more difficult to love an adopted child than a biological child? We've heard a couple of these families that we've seen the videos. The lady that talked so much and wouldn't let her husband talk a couple weeks ago, who said that they had finally, they had adopted several children. They had adopted a biracial child, and the grandfather said, I don't know if I'm going to be able to love this child. I want to, but I don't know if I can. And as they said, he had a wonderful bond. He did love her. He did bond with her. You heard another lady say, when I adopted, I think his name was Jacob. When I adopted Jacob, I thought I was not going to be able to love him the way I loved my biological son, but I did. Sometimes adoptive parents take leaps of faith on whether or not this is going to work. Infant adoptees, it's a very common fallacy if you're bringing a child from another country that they're not going to grieve the loss of the birth family and the heritage. And here's where this comes in. The video that I showed you of Kim Long, the Korean girl, it talked about the fact that where was she raised? I think in Omaha, someplace in the Corn Belt, where there were no other Korean children. And that she was really grieving her heritage. She wanted to know where she came from. She wanted her daughter, I think her daughter's name was Juniper. She had a baby, and she wanted Juniper to know what her heritage was, because she was grieving it. If you go on YouTube and you Google Korean adoptions, for some reason, there's a lot of YouTube videos about kids that were brought over from Korea into the United States and adopted, not feeling like they're a part of their adoptive family. Whether it's the difference in physicality, they look different, they felt different, but there's several, which I found very interesting, YouTube videos where these young adults got to be 20, 21, and they went back to Korea because they wanted to see what Korean culture was, what a Korean person was really like within their country. But you might find those interesting if you just Google that on YouTube, because there's a lot of that. And it's certainly the last fallacy is that being chosen, it gives you a secure attachment. It gives you a secure relationship. Well, it's fine to say that you were chosen. You were chosen. But in order for you to be chosen, somebody else had to give you up. So there's always that kind of yin and yang to some of the stuff. We have certainly, these are research findings, but I'll tell you, these are my findings too, that we just see that lack of information, hiding the history, makes the searches more wanted and more difficult. Adoptive families are just different. They're not less than a biological family. Do they often feel less than a biological family? They often do. And it is because some of the microaggressions that we do to them, it makes them feel like they are less than, but they aren't. They're just different, and recognizing the differences is what we're trying to help you with here. The work is all about grief and loss. Grief and loss are common themes. Even kids who are adopted as babies always have that fantasy family in the sky. So we're going to be helping our families deal with the fact that this is there, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It doesn't mean that the adoption isn't a good adoption. We're going to spend a little bit of time on this, and then I'm going to move into something else. What is it that makes the adjustment difficult for kids coming out of foster care? For one thing, probably well over half of the kids that are adopted in the United States are coming out of the foster care system. So what's happened to them? They've had all kinds of things happen to them. They've many times been exposed in utero to drugs. They often, when we look at how old were they when they were first placed, if you open up a case that you get tomorrow and you see that this is a 6-year-old who was removed for the first time when he or she was 1 or 2, maybe given back because mom got it together, then removed again when she was 3, and then try again, mom gets it together again. One of the difficult things with the opioid crisis is that there's recovery and return. recovery, and return. So kids go back home, parents relapse, kids come back into the system. So we're looking at placement history. We're looking at how old they were when they were first removed. We're going to look at separation from siblings. I don't know if you've ever given a lot of thought to that, but separation from siblings is a really, really impactful thing for a child. And the the video that I couldn't get you to see when I was going to try to show you removed, in that video, her baby brother is taken out of her arms. And it is the most difficult thing about being removed. It wasn't the difficulty with the mother being abused by the father, or the father drinking, or the father beating the little girl up. It was the fact that she lost her baby brother. And I think a lot of adult adoptive children will tell you that that's a really difficult thing, to not have their siblings. If we have time, I actually have a video that a couple of teenage brothers did when they had been separated from their siblings. They had twin brothers that were much younger than they were, and they were separated from them. And they asked their case manager if they could do a video and plead their case for why they wanted these kids back with them. That was, I'm guessing that was probably 2007. It was a while ago. But if we have time, I'll show it to you, because they did eventually get reunited with their brothers. And it was just kind of a unique and creative way to plead their case. But being separated from your siblings is tough. Family structure, it has a lot to do with it. If your adoptive family is very, very different than the family structure that you're used to, that's difficult for kids. We had two little girls. They were Hispanic, and they had been adopted by a very quiet Caucasian couple. They had no children. They lived a very quiet life. And the therapist was trying to figure out why this adoption wasn't gelling. And she had the child, she had the kids do a family, we call it a critogram. It was an intervention. I'll show it to you. I think in the last module, I think we get into some of this. But what the critogram kind of showed the therapist is that these kids kind of missed their culture. They came from a Hispanic neighborhood, and it was a very integrated neighborhood. They did not necessarily the people they were removed from, but the neighborhood they were in. They had a lot of block parties. There were a lot of people in and out of the houses all the time. And they just said they found these people so quiet, that they just weren't used to them being so quiet. So what you're used to is what you're used to. And if you get placed into a family where it's a very different culture or a very different way of being, just finding out what those differences are is important. It didn't mean that the white Caucasian couple suddenly had to jump up and down and have a lot of parties. It meant that everybody had to recognize that they came from different backgrounds, and how could they kind of come together in the middle and meet that. And of course, the level of trauma that your child experiences before your child comes into your home is the biggest thing that you as an adoptive parent have to look at, because that trauma isn't going away overnight. That trauma is going to be there. It's going to be there, like we call it the canary in the coal mine. It's going to be there like the canary in the coal mine forever. It's just that it has to be dealt with. It was following this has nothing to do with this training, but following the hostages that just were released from Hamas, and one of the doctors who examined them said, don't keep telling them that they look okay, because they're not okay. These people have been in extreme trauma for 10 months. They haven't been fed, they've been tortured, they've been beaten, but the media keeps reporting that they look okay. Well, they look okay. They're not okay, and they're probably not going to be okay for a very long time. It's the same with kids. Kids can come into foster care and look okay, but they may not be okay. And it's okay for us to help the foster parent or the adoptive parents to learn how to deal with that. So those are the kids. What are the adoptive parents? What do they have to do in order to bring these kids into their homes? Well, for one thing, if you adopt a child and you love that child and you want the best for that child, what kind of feelings do you think you're going to have about the birth family, bless you, about the birth family that hurt this kid, about the birth family that tortured this kid, that abused this kid, that neglected this kid, that made this kid into the traumatized child that he is today? You're going to have very negative feelings about the child's birth family. And that is something that you have to say to the adoptive parents, keep it to yourself. Don't talk about it in front of your kids. Don't talk about them in the birth family. Don't say negative things about them. And it's hard for a lot of adoptive parents to not do that. And they think that they're supporting their child by saying, your mother was wrong. You didn't deserve what your mother did to you. They already know that. So we really have to help adoptive parents to share those feelings with us. That's what we're here for. We're here to listen to you. The GAL is here to listen to you, but don't do it in front of the kids. You have to integrate that child into your family, and that is not as easy as one might think. We have parents who bring kids in and everything is ready for them. They've got a beautiful bedroom, they've got clothes laid out, they've got toys, they've got a trip to Disneyland or Disney World or whatever it's called these days planned. They're going to do all these wonderful things, but that doesn't mean that integration has taken place. It means that you've had some fun times, or maybe not, or maybe the child gets to the Magic Kingdom and has a meltdown, and you don't understand why this child is having a meltdown, and then you're disappointed because your expectations haven't been met. So the path of integration is something that we can help our families with by helping them to just take it a little at a time. Take it a day at a time, sort of like Alcoholics Anonymous, just take it a day at a time. And you have to help your families create an environment where kids can talk to them about anything. Now, I realize I've seen these videos many more times than you have, but the teenage girl that had the blue eyeshadow that talked so much in one of the videos, I can see you recognize who I'm talking about. But she said, if you're an adoptive parent, you need to let the child talk about their family. You need to let the child talk about what they miss or what they remember about their family. And that goes along with not being negative about the birth parents. It's something that you do need to do. You as an adoptive parent need to let them talk about what they've gone through. Because that's going to help your child cope with the loss. It's going to help your child search for his identity when he or she is ready. And this is all part of integration. And the reason I put coping with adoption loss in red with infertility is, again, I'm telling you, if you don't have a whole lot of knowledge of the ins and outs of what happens to couples when they go through infertility, Google it. The internet's a wealth of information about it if you've never gone through it before, but it does make people feel less than. Women who cannot, quotes, produce a baby feel like there's something wrong with them. The man who says that his sperm count isn't enough, maybe because he had measles as a child or some other physical problem, and he cannot help his partner have a baby. There's a lot of loss there. For many, many people, the need to get married and have children is kind of a natural step. It isn't for everybody, but it's a natural step for a lot of people. And if you suddenly find that you cannot do it, it is a real loss to your identity and your sense of who you are. So I think I said this before, but when the therapists go out and start to assess what they need to do with their families, if it is a youngish couple with no children, we always try to get to the infertility issue. because, and it's not something you're gonna talk about in front of the kids, but it is something that we want the therapist to be able to tap into, to say, you know, maybe these are some of the things that we need to talk about here. Do you have a fantasy baby in the sky? Because most people who can't have biological children do have a fantasy baby in the sky. And then this little child that you have adopted is not that fantasy baby. So those are just things that we need to help people work through. Okay, hold on. I want to see where I want to get to here. Just let me pop this forward a little bit so I can see where we are. Give me a minute here because this is a longer training and I'm not going to cover all of it. I want to make sure we cover the stuff that we need to cover. Okay, we're going to talk about the common clinical issues that you as therapists are going to be dealing with. And they're for both the adoptive parents and the kids. These are the most common issues that we are going to face when we open up our cases and say, what do we have to deal with here? You're always going to start with separation and loss because everybody has it. Parents have it, kids have it, biological kids have it. And it doesn't mean that you can't get through it. And it doesn't mean that you can't help them with it. It just means that it's usually at the top of the list. Relationship problems and then just self-development. Everybody at the time of adoption feels a certain amount of loss, and it varies depending on the situation, but for children, they're always going to, even if they were very young when they were adopted, they're always going to have that fantasy about a birth family. It's harder when they know nothing about their families. And it's hard if they do know something about their families because a lot of kids are adopted when they're older. They do know what the history of the family is, and they do know the difficulties. And still, there's always that thought that my mother is out there looking for me, or my father is out there trying to find me. Even as unrealistic as that may be, in certain situations, it's almost always there. Because we don't fantasize about having a mother hooked on opioids and living in a crack house, do we? We fantasize about a mother that is pretty and cheerful and loves us and makes cookies for us. Those are our fantasies. And I'll tell you where I see those fantasies a lot. We do comprehensive behavioral health assessments here. We have a couple of assessors who do them. And one of our assessors is very good when she meets with the child about saying, tell me about your mother, tell me about your family. And sometimes when she writes, she'll write what the children say. And it's obviously not what happened. But what kids will say is, my mother played with me all the time. My mother made me nice meals. We ate together. These fantasies can get pretty elaborate, right down to what games they played and how she played with them and what she made and did she make chocolate chip cookies. None of these things have ever happened.
It's a big deal for us to pay it.
I don't know what that was. I'm sorry. But kids will have fantasies and they're not going to fantasize bad things. They're going to fantasize good things. So for kids, fantasies about the birth family, for parents, especially those dealing with infertility, there's always fantasies about the birth child. And that is just going to happen. And it's okay to let your parents talk about what they think if they had been able to have a child, what would that child have looked like? Because I guarantee you that they know what that child would look like. I guarantee you that they're going to tell you exactly what color hair, what color eyes, what they look like, what they like to do, what they were good in, what they were bad in. And that's okay. They can have a fantasy child as long as they recognize that that fantasy child will be perfect in the sky, in heaven. The child on the ground is not going to be perfect. So that's where you're dealing with separation and loss. Relationship problems. I'm just going to say what the schools of thought are here, and then you can decide how where your thought process is on this. But there are some schools of thought that bonding and attachment are different things. That bonding is what happens in utero to the birth mother, and attachment is what happens after birth. I've gone back and forth on this in different lectures with different people presenting this, but bonding certainly does happen physiologically with your birth mother. It can happen in not a good way if your birth mother is using drugs or alcohol or is extreme amount of stress in the relationship. That bonding can produce a jittery neonate. It can produce a baby that's predisposed to certain issues because the relationship, the physiological relationship with the birth mother was difficult due to a number of circumstances. Attachment is really the big issue that we have to focus with, because with most children, when they come into foster care, their attachments have been interrupted. And you heard some of those kids talk about being moved a lot, which means that they're not attaching in any degree to the people that they're living with. The very, very first video that I showed you was Stephen and Mr. Hancock. And Stephen said, as he was talking about all of the foster homes that he was in before he ended up in group care, and as he said, I don't remember none of them. Well, he probably did remember something about them, and probably it wasn't anything very positive because he was in multiple foster homes. So if you are moved constantly, as the girl who came home and found her stuff on the front porch, this is not an attaching relationship. This isn't a trusting relationship. So almost all kids are going to come into an adoption if they've been in the foster care system with some kind of attachment issues. One of the questions that I got recently, and it was from a minister, she asked me if we provided services to kids with reactive attachment disorder. Now, for those of you who work for Circle of Friends, we don't use that diagnosis. And we don't use that diagnosis for no other reason than many lay people think that's the kiss of death. Many lay people believe that you cannot ever recover from reactive attachment disorder. So what we always say, and I've heard that from adoptive parents too, that, you know, I don't know why we adopted him because he has reactive attachment disorder and this is never going to work. All kids in foster care have disordered attachment, and attachment can be facilitated and learned, and it can improve. It has to improve with time. It has to improve with trust, but attachment can be taught, it can be learned, and it can grow, which is why we don't talk about reactive attachment disorder. We talk about disordered attachment. It's a lot less scary for adoptive parents to hear that than to hear that diagnosis. Now, I know that some of you are a little bit younger, so you probably don't remember the 90s. The 90s is when reactive attachment disorder hit on the scene, and with very, very negative connotations. Reactive attachment disorder, there was a PBS documentary called Child of Rage that I still have. I don't even think you can find it on YouTube anymore, but it was about a child who, quotes, had reactive attachment disorder. And it went on over like several months. But it was very negative. It presented a very negative picture of the fact that if you have this horrible disorder, you will never get over it. It's not true. And that's why a lot of adoptive parents would just say, I don't want to adopt this child because I've read or I know that you can never get better from this. we have got to dispel that fallacy almost immediately when we get into our families, because it isn't the kiss of death. It is not something that cannot be healed. Of course, anything can be turned around. And of course, the kids all have self-esteem issues. Frankly, so do the adoptive parents. If you're adopting because you weren't able to do some of the things in your life that you wanted to do, you may have gone into this thinking that this is less than the life that I wanted to have. And that's not true either. Self-identity, again, this is where the search comes in. Why do people look for their roots? Because they want to know who they are. Why do people go to Ancestry.com and 23andMe? Why do people do all that? Why did Alex Haley write Roots? Because he wanted to know where his family came from. So self-identity is a big part of what we're going to help our kids and our parents to kind of do together. And we're going to talk about, just briefly, because I want to get into the next section of this. Let me see what time it is. When I talk about loss with adoptive children, there are 6 dimensions of loss that we look at, that we try to keep in mind when we're trying to help the family work their way through this. And you probably don't always think about things like this, but there's no universal loss for adopted families. Universality in loss means something that everybody knows. Everybody knows what death is. Everybody has had somebody die. Everybody has had something happen that the whole world understands, and that usually is death. That is a universal loss. But in adoption, there's nothing universal about what happens with adoptive families. The only people who understand what they're feeling are other adoptive families, which is why our adoption support group is so helpful. That our adoption support group helps families come together and experience and express the losses that they've felt along the way with other people that will understand those losses. That's what support groups are. Support groups are for people that are experiencing something that the whole world hasn't experienced. And I just spoke to, actually, on Tuesday, a woman who attends our support group. And her adoptive child is 21. And she said, I can't tell you how helpful it is to get together with other adoptive families once a month and just talk about the things that other people who haven't experienced that just don't understand. So there is a certain amount of isolation for adoptive parents, and that there's nothing wrong with them going to support groups or joining with other people, because it makes them feel less alone and less isolated. The other thing about loss is that our adoptive kids don't understand permanence. So permanence means it's going to stay in one place. It's not going to change. You're always going to be in this family. You're always going to be this mother's child. You're always going to be the child of this father. That's not our world in adoption. They don't have permanence. They don't understand the idea of permanence. And I realize that the concept of forever families, they had to come up with something. But when forever families turn out to be not forever families, and things don't work out, and they give the kids back, that's why adoptive kids don't always understand that concept of permanence. And the relationship with the lost parent, that's always going to be there. And I can't say that enough. Adoptive parent or adoptive children are always going to have some ghost in the sky, even if they were very young when they were adopted, about who this person would have been. And that kind of goes into our whole thing about searching, that it's just always going to be there. The lost parent is always going to be there. And this is the other thing, is that this is not the choice of the adoptee. The adoptee is not the one who decided that he or she was going to walk away from his parents. It's not the child's decision. It was not their choice. They may be happy in their adoptive home, but it was not their choice. And it's very often not the choice of the biological parents who are unable, for all of the reasons that we see in the world today, to do their case plans and get their kids back. We talk about the opioid problem. The opioid problem is the number one reason that our kids come into foster care. And do those parents choose the drugs over their children? They do. Uh, but I don't know too many addicts who are going to say to you, that was a great choice. I'm so glad I chose drugs over my kids. Um, Addiction is addiction, and it takes the voluntary decision away from biological parents. For those of you who have been involved with termination of parental rights cases, they're very difficult. Nobody wants to separate a parent and a child. The judge doesn't want it, the attorneys don't want it, the case managers don't want it. And there are many, many good case managers who will go out of their way to try to help these parents to meet their case plans. And then when they can't, we have no choice but to terminate. The judge has no choice but to terminate. But is it easy for anybody in the adoption triad? It is not. And we can't, again, underestimate what the extent of loss is for these kids when they've lost their biological parents and they've lost their culture, they've lost their heritage, maybe they've been brought from another country, which again is why I find the series with the Koreans very interesting, that they really want to get back, and they talk about trying the food and walking around the streets and just listening to the noises and the smells and everything and thinking maybe this is where I was supposed to be all along. You can't underestimate that. You can help people with it. You can help your adoptive parents to say, okay, this child came from India, this child came from Africa, this child came from the Ukraine. We can help that child get in touch with that part of their heritage. It doesn't mean that they're not going to love you. And I am going to move through some of this because I want to get to something else. Like I said, this is a very long training and we're not going to get through it all. So I have to try to hit the highlights and hit the things that I want you to see. You know what? Why don't you take a 5-minute break and let me see if I can get myself where I need to get. It's 5 after. Just come back here about 10 after.
And so what do you find your, yeah, just charms on the back of me. Oh, so that's when you hear click, click, click. I was like, I shouldn't have worn these today, because they're probably a little loud. I could just hear them like they came out, I couldn't figure out what it was.
Okay, you guys, why don't we get back together? Okay, we're gonna go over a few of the clinical interventions that we use. A lot of this are things that we certainly use at Circle of Friends, but I want you to come away with this with some really clear idea about what you're going to do. Because we go to these trainings and we talk a lot about theory, and then the most common comment I get sometimes after we do some of these trainings is, okay, but what do I do? How do I do this? So we always include a lot of clinical interventions, talk about ways that you can do things. I think it's the last module on the 5th day. We're going to look at some art therapy, some sand trays, some very specific things that the therapist can do. But these are some of the more common clinical interventions that we use. And I was looking at the break for our life book journal, which somebody must have walked away with because I can't find it. But life books are really good clinical interventions to do with kids, and they can be started at any point along the way. But if there's anybody that doesn't know what a life book is, think about what I said about your mother having baby pictures of you, and she might have filled out that baby book that everybody got in the hospital about how much you weighed and when you did things and all of that. These kids don't have life books. Their lives have been very disrupted. So life books, at any point, someone can start a life book for a child. There are wonderful foster parents who have done them for a lot of our kids. And when they then leave and go into the adoptive home, they have pictures of a 4th grade birthday party, or they have pictures of a Christmas maybe that they spent with this family. It gives them history. And it gives a chance for a child to talk about where he or she came from. So life books can be done in any one of a number of ways. They don't have to be a book. It can be any way we want to help our child remember who they are. We don't think about this because our history is everywhere, isn't it? Our history is in our pictures. Our history is in talking to our sisters and brothers about what we did when we were kids. Our mother saying, I remember when you did that when you were in 1st grade. These children don't have history. So having it represented in a life book is really important. And I have seen some really very sad representations of this. I worked with she was 13. She was adopted, a 13-year-old girl. She was adopted. She was a Black child adopted by a white family. And it was sadly a very toxic adoption. And she had been placed in foster care. And she came in one day to see me, and she had a book in her hand. And she opened the book, and she had a ripped picture of her mother. And I asked her where she got it, and she said, well, it was in my life book. And when I came to this home, I had a life book, and my mother's picture was in it, and they wouldn't let me have it. So she snuck into the life book and ripped the picture of the mother out and snuck it into this foster home, which is a very sad thing for a child to have to do something like that, to stay in some connection. That was an adoption that failed. And probably there were many reasons for that, but certainly I'm sure if you think about your work with foster kids, we've all had those examples where kids come in and they have nothing. I interviewed a little boy, he was 9, and he had been removed, and he was in a foster home, and they were a nice foster home. They were very good to him. But I sat in his bedroom talking to him, and he held a picture of his mother that had been taken in the park. Somebody took it, and he said, the day they came to get me, I hid this in my pocket so I would have my mother. We just don't realize how important our history is until we don't have it anymore. So life books are a very good thing to do with kids and to help adoptive parents to do with kids. One of the adoptive parents had a different way of doing a life book. They had adopted a child when the child was 2, and they had put together their life book before the child got there. So they had pictures of themselves when they were children, and they had pictures of the house that they were building, and then the house when it was finished, and then the dog that they had bought. And then they adopted the child, and then they began to incorporate pictures of him in his room and him on his bike. And so they kind of, it was just a nice way to do it, that they started with their history and moved into his. So you can do it any way you want. What you are trying to help adoptive parents is to just help them to see that this child does have a life, and you want that life to be honored. So that's just one way to do it. I'm going to show you just a really quick little video. Pictorial timelines are really good ways for kids to figure out where they came from and what happened. And it's a little bit easier than going out and saying, just tell me a little bit about why you're here, or how did you end up in foster care, or how did you get to this adoptive family. Pictorial timelines are really easy things for kids to do, and our therapists like to do them. I'm going to show you this. This is on our YouTube channel as well. This is Amy Iannatelli, who was our vice president, or she was our executive director, I'm sorry. And she loved to do pictorial timelines, and she got really good placement history. So I'm going to show you that real quick. That this is the pictorial timeline key. If you have this event, you're going to draw this, and it's in your handouts. If you want to try to use it with a kid, all you need to have is a piece of paper, really. She used a flip chart, but you don't need that.
Hi, I'm Amy Iannatelli, Executive Director of Circle of Friends Services. We provide in-home counseling services to children and families in the child welfare system. We specialize in trauma, and this is one of the play therapy interventions that we use with our kids. So today I'm going to demonstrate a play therapy intervention. It's a creative intervention that we use called the pictorial timeline. And this will help children to explore their trauma narrative, explore what has happened to them, but in a playful and non-directive way, so that they can use pictures to show what's happened to them instead of using words and having to verbalize what has happened. So the first thing you want to do for this activity is you want to draw the line, the actual timeline, beginning with when they were born and ending with their current age. So I'm going to do that now. And we're gonna pretend that this child is 10 years old. So we put 0 to 10. Now, the next thing I do when I'm meeting with a child is I'll explain that we're going to fill in significant things that have happened to him or her at various ages. And they don't have to remember everything. They don't have to know the exact age that they were. It's okay to take their best guess. They can include their family members. I've been in homes where they want to include mom and say, hey mom, when did this happen to me? Or when did I change schools? And then that will invite the parent to be involved in this process. And that's okay. That's really a good thing. It's really up to the child and the family and your clinical decision on who needs to be included in this session. So again, just reinforce with the child and family that this does not have to be perfect and they do not have to be a good artist. They can really just do the best that they can. So the next thing I do with them is I will go through, I have a list, which we will share with you at the end of this video, of significant events that have happened to children and how we're going to represent them with a picture. So the first thing on my list that I have, and I will say this to a child, can you please draw some blocks when you first started school? So the child will maybe say, okay. At age 5, I started a new school. So probably when he went to kindergarten. And these are some blocks. Then the next one, as I'll say, if you had a new baby born into your family, draw when that happened. And again, you don't have to stick to black. I let kids choose whatever color they want to do. So we're going to choose blue. And we're going to say that maybe at 4, they had a new baby born. Now, there's a whole bunch of these, probably about 15 different events. Not all of them will apply. You can go through each one and see if that applies to them. If you know it doesn't, you can skip it. If they would like to fill in any other ones that you didn't describe, that's allowed too. I'm going to do one more, and then we're going to talk about how to process this event. The next one can be joined a team, club, or organization. That's a positive event. We want to include both. So maybe at 6 years old, they joined a team or a club that they felt really good about. Okay. So you would go through the whole series until they're done. And then I'm going to show you what that might look like. So here's one that's much more filled out. And I'm going to point out what some of these mean for you. A triangle represents that the client went into foster care. A house represents that they moved. The 3 bars represents that a family member went to jail. A sad face represents that the child witnessed family violence. This is a pill bottle that is crossed out, meaning they had a family member go receive substance abuse treatment. This is a gravestone representing that a child had a death in the family. So again, we're going to include all these symbols for you on a separate slide at the end of the video, so you'll have that information to do this yourself. But once it's all done, you can see that it represents visually for you what's going on with this child, and they get to have that insight as well. So for this particular child, you can see a lot of stuff what was happening at age 9. And really, this is a lot of trauma. So not only was he put into foster care, but then a lot of changes happened. He changed schools. he moved, he witnessed family violence. This is a lot, and sometimes the clients might not even have the insight to know that a lot had happened in a very short amount of time. So as the therapist, this gives you opportunity to help the client gain insight, to express their feelings about things, to start the trauma narrative in a really safe way. And the therapist can validate their feelings, validate how scary things might have been, validate some accomplishments that they've had in the past and their strengths. It also gives the therapist an opportunity to get rid of faulty thinking. You know, the child might say, you know, well, this was my fault. And you get opportunity to say, this was not your fault. And you can talk about adults' job to keep them safe. So instead of having a very difficult conversation, this becomes a whole lot easier through the use of play and art and a medium that's a lot more comfortable for children. So again, I'm going to include the instructions and all the symbols for you on a separate slide right after this video, with also my contact information if you have any questions. So good luck to you, and thanks for watching this play therapy intervention.
I have to say that when we first started doing these YouTube videos, we had very dramatic entrances. We don't do that anymore. But one of the things about the pictorial timeline is that you only need a piece of paper. And it's a lot easier for kids to draw that stuff out than it is to talk about it. So I don't even limit the age that we do this with, because it's hard for all of our kids to say what happened to them, but it's easier. That's why we try to come up with different ways that you can do it, whether it's through art, through sand tray, through different ways that you can get them to understand that their history has affected them, and it probably is affecting the way they are now in this adoptive family. So we do use the pictorial timeline. We do use life books. We use rituals, and rituals. The thing with adoptive families is that they have major events that are not universal, as we said. So they have to come up with their own kind of rituals to commemorate. Usually rituals help you to deal with loss, or they help you to celebrate. We talked about the adoptions in the courtroom are very ritualistic. The adoptions that take place in the family court are happy events, and the families are all there, and the judge asks the child, do you want to be adopted? And asks the family, do you want to adopt this child? And then we have pictures, we have teddy bears, we have all kinds of happy things. That's a ritual that only adoptive parents understand, because it's their ritual. But we have to help, sometimes we have to help our families to kind of come up with the things that they might do to celebrate. I mean, you heard that the sibling group of 3 talked about having, was it the second birthday or the new birthday? Some people have balloon releases, some people have naming days, they have the gotcha cakes, things like that. Those are rituals that just help the child remember where he came from and where he's going. And it helps the family too. It helps the family to say, okay, here's a picture for the life book of you releasing the balloons up into the air. Here's a picture for your second birthday or your new birthday, or however you want to say it. But rituals are just symbols, and it gives the families a way to celebrate or provide meaning to life transitions. And that's what rituals are. We for the older kids, we do encourage them to write letters, to journal. The younger kids can sometimes do this in a different way. Sometimes our younger kids do this by drawing pictures, and that's okay, because until you are old enough to learn how to actually write things down in written form, you still have those memories, and you can have the family draw draw a picture. I showed you Sarah Allen last week with the Family Shield. That's another really ritualistic way of journaling or saying, this is where my family is now. My family has these strengths and this is who we are. So journaling and letter writing are always a good thing to do, or doing it in different ways. If they want to draw, if the family wants to do a family drawing, it just helps people pull together. And it also gives you kind of a structure around your therapeutic sessions, because what you really want to avoid is tangential thinking. And you get that a lot in families. They're waiting for you to come, you get there, and then it's like diarrhea of the mouth. They kind of spew everything that happened the week before, and you've only got an hour. So you want to keep things as structured as you can, and this gives you that opportunity. All right, this is what I mean when I say these trainings jump from thing to thing. We're going to talk about transracial adoption. I think I said to you last week, the whole thing has flipped, that it used to be 80% of the adoptions that were transracial were coming from other countries, and only 20% were domestic transracial adoptions. And that has completely flipped over. And now 80% of are domestic transracial, and only about 20% are coming in from other countries. Some of that has to do with the way the world is. I mean, there's just such upheaval in the world. Different countries have used the whole adoption process as a political weapon. We've had countries who have refused to release the children that have been adopted, refused to let them go and move to the countries of the families that they're in, depending on who's mad at whom in the world right now. There's certainly been a lot of domestic and political upheaval in places like Haiti. Certainly Russia, the Ukraine right now. So it's just become very, very difficult sometimes for parents to go over and try to bring a child in from another country. So what we've seen is a really big increase in transracial adoption. And there are pros and cons to transracial adoption. It doesn't mean that you as a family shouldn't do it. It means that, as with anything, if you're adopting an opioid child, if you're adopting a child that has significant sexual trauma, you just have to know what it is that you're dealing with and how to deal with that. So these are families that are going to adopt from a different racial group than their own. And what we need to do with those families is help them to have a safe connection so that they can connect with other people in their experience, and they can help that child maintain connection to their own culture. It does have its complications. And that's why when I showed you Kim Long, she felt that it was complicated. She didn't say anything bad about her adopted family. She just said she grew up in an area where she was the only Korean child in this town, and that she felt she looked different, she felt different, and she was also raised in an era when we told adoptive parents that they really should just treat all children the same. And that is really not our current thinking. We have to recognize the culture from which they came. When we say there's 5 stages of a transracial adoption, when adoptees first come into a home that is a different race or culture from their own home, there is usually that initial thinking that this is going to be fine, that this is not going to matter at all. It doesn't matter if you're Black and I'm white. It doesn't matter that you don't know where I came from or you didn't understand me. There's just a thought that it's going to work out. The other thing, we call that is the honeymoon period, and we do all have a honeymoon period. But there is generally a realization eventually that you are a different family. Mr. Mitchell talked about taking his kids into a restaurant where they had different kids from different races and different cultures. And when they did that, that was when people would come up to them and say, "Are you a group home? Because you can't possibly be this child's father." I actually watched it was a Kelly Clarkson show. It was a little clip on YouTube yesterday because I was trying to find some clips for you to show you today. And it was a Black family that had adopted a white baby. And the baby had been in the NICU, and the mother had been a volunteer who went in and did the skin to skin thing for the NICU babies and became very attached to this baby, and they adopted him. And he was on the show with them, and he was maybe 2. And she said, all of our other children that we adopted have been Black. They had three children that they had adopted before this baby. But she said, this is the only one where I have been in the park with him, and people have asked me if I was the maid or the nanny or the housekeeper. And the father commented that he had the baby in the car seat in the back of the car, and that the police pulled him over and asked him if this is his child, and why does he have this child? So you are different. You are looked at differently. So what do we do? That's where, when I say support groups are a wonderful thing, we try, if you're a transracial adoptee or a family, you're going to try to surround yourself with other people that are in the same situation. It never is good to feel isolated in an issue. You always want to have other people around you that can say, this is how I dealt with it. And I know that the issue that the mom was talking about is true, because I've actually seen that and had other people say that to me, that if you have a white child that you've adopted, there's just the thought that you can't possibly be this child's adopted parent. You've got to be the maid, you've got to be the housekeeper, you've got to be the nanny, you've got to be something else. So for that, you need strength, and you need to have other people around you that can support you. Because we really eventually get to the point where we internalize that this is different. For a while, we try not to stand out, but eventually, I think you're going to find that with transracial adoption, if it's going to work, you've just got to embrace the fact that you are different, that you recognize it, that you saw one of the videos that I showed you where the lady said when the George Floyd shooting happened, that she had a Black child. She wasn't 100% sure how to best approach that Black child. She recognized that she had a problem. And that's where I think what we want to get transracial adoptees and families to understand is that they're going to go along a continuum where they're going to go into this thinking this is going to be fine. And then they're going to recognize the issues and they're going to deal with them, and then it will be fine. But you can't pretend that it's not there. And we can't pretend that these people are not racially diverse. So actually, this is one of the ones that I did find that I was going to show you, and I was going to try to, I think this is one of the ones that I can't put on the recording for YouTube. You know what? I'm going to stop the recording because I think this one is copyrighted. And so I'm going to stop it and then come back after. Otherwise, I won't be able to put this on YouTube. Okay, where did my record button go? I got too many screens open here. That's the problem. Okay. We have a lot of books and we have a lot of things in our YouTube channel to help parents with interracial adoption. And actually, if you go on the YouTube channel, there's a whole playlist on transracial adoption where I've put a lot of videos on up there. The thing that I find with a lot of them is that it's probably the people that are recording for YouTube. I mean, anybody can put anything on YouTube, but a lot of the videos that you see are very negative about the fact that they were adopted into a different racial family. So I think it's really important to understand what happens when you adopt a child from another race or culture. And you really, really need to understand that race and culture. And you need to understand that you are not of that race or culture and integrate those families as best you can. So that is basically what I would say about that. And I'm sorry, I can't show you that YouTube video. So let's get into search, and I'm not going to show you that search right now. I'm going to show you some other videos, provided I can make them work. But when we get old enough to start to want to look for our family culture and information, we are going to it's just going to become a part of what you are as an adoptive child. That's why, if those of you who don't know that Florida has a reunion registry, Florida has what's called the Adoption Reunion Registry. And you, as a biological parent or a biological adopted child, can provide your family information. You can sign up, you can provide family information, medical history. You can give permission. If the child comes forward at a certain age, you as an adoptive parent can give your permission. You can give this child my information. This is something that we did not have years ago. And it made the whole issue of searching, as I was coming up as a younger therapist trying to help people with this, it just destroyed people because they could not find their biological parents. And I had my original private practice in Massachusetts was in the 90s, early 2000s. We didn't have the stuff that we have now. We didn't have Facebook and Google and the internet and all this stuff. So people had to really rely on the laws and the rules in their states. And many states would not allow any kind of information to be released. I think, I mean, I may have told you, maybe I didn't. The very first job that I ever had was at Catholic Charities, and it was in Troy, New York. And I worked with the biological parents who were giving their children up, and I worked with the adoptive parents. So it's sort of like one-stop shop. The girls come in and they would have the babies, and this was in the 70s before abortion, and then we would place the children for adoption. But when we recorded their information in files, we changed their names. And I remember saying to the director, I hadn't been there for very long, I said, well, if you change the baby's name, or if you change the mother's name, how is that child ever going to grow up and find this parent? And she said, well, they won't, because that's the whole reason we're doing it. So if you gave birth to a child and your name was Mary Smith, you were cross-referenced under Ann Woods. So that there was no way for adoptive children to come in and find their biological parents. And that led to a lot of heartache with a lot of kids. So that's why we spend a lot of time on talking about helping kids to search for their biological roots, because it's important. It's important for a whole lot of reasons. The reason we used to give was medical history. And why did we always talk about medical history? Because it was the easiest thing to talk about. It was the least emotional thing to talk about. It was, you wanted to know if your father had diabetes. So that's okay. But if you wanted to know if your birth mother was sad when she gave you up, your adoptive parents didn't want you to know that. So the whole search thing has become a very difficult thing, very different thing in 2024. But the reunion registry provides a really good service. They presented at the summit a couple of years ago. I went to that presentation, and they had an adoptee. He was in his 50s, and he talked about how helpful it was, because he'd never been able, he was very young when he was adopted, and it was in that time when you couldn't give out information. And he tried 23andMe, he tried Ancestry.com, and he said, well, I got a little bit about my genetic history, my biological history, but I really wanted to know my parents. And the reunion registry was able to connect him with his parents. They were both elderly. His mother was a recovering drug addict, and she was in a memory care center. And I think that the father might have been dead by the time he did this. But he talked about how comforting it was because he spent 2 months with his mother before she passed away. And he said, I got to see what she looked like. I got to talk to her. She got to tell me about her opioid abuse and how young she was when it happened, and she wasn't able to take care of me. So for him, it was a very healing thing. Had he not been able to find her, was he ever always going to have the fantasy mother in the sky? Yeah, he was. So the reunion registry is a good resource for us to know is out there. And that's why I put medical history first, because it's the easiest thing to look at. But really, why are we looking? Why are we searching? We need to connect to who we are. Can you imagine if you didn't just think about this for a minute? Because I'm an Irish American. We're all from someplace, although we don't seem to like to admit it right now, but we're all from someplace. And I know who I am. I know what my heritage is. The first time I went to Ireland, I remember getting off the plane in Dublin and looking around, and I said to my husband, "These people all look like me." And he said, "Yeah, because you look very Irish." I did not know that. And I was young when that happened. It was a real mind blower for me that these people all look like my relatives. But imagine if you didn't have that knowledge. Imagine if you did not know what nationality you were, where you came from, why you had blue eyes, why you had blonde hair. Imagine if you did not have that history, you would have identity problems, wouldn't you? Because you'd really be trying to piece all this together. So it's important to connect to history. It's important just to know who you are and why you look the way you do or why you act the way you do. One of our more difficult cases that we had, probably goes back several years, is that we had a Black family who had adopted as very young children a sibling group. They were Hispanic. And as they got older, they began to realize that they did not look like their family. They were little when they came into this. They began to realize that they didn't look like their family. They didn't look like their family of origin or the family that they were with. And finally, with some prodding from the therapist who had the case, they were able to tell the adoptive parents were able to tell the children that they were Hispanic, that they were not Black. And it was rough for a while. I mean, for one thing, these kids were now teenagers. And what do you do in your teenage years? You identify, you figure out who you are, you try to figure out why you're the way you are. And for these kids to suddenly have this 360, where one minute they were Black and the next minute they were Hispanic, they were all incredibly angry with their adoptive parents. And we had some work to do to work through that with them. And we did. But it was a mistake. It was a mistake that the adoptive parents made. They thought the kids were little. They didn't think they'd notice. And they did notice. So our kids, yeah, do they need their medical history? Sure they do. Where do we see that? On the soap operas, when the baby needs an organ transplant and it's not his real father or something, that's the least of it. We certainly get into it when if kids do get sick, then yeah, it's important. But one of our therapists who is adopted, she's probably in her late 30s, talks about she had an emergency room visit, she went to the hospital, something happened. And the doctor asked her a little bit about her medical history. And she said, "Well, I'm adopted. I don't really know what it is." And her adoptive father was with her. And she said, "My father got so angry with me that I told the doctor that I didn't know what my history was, but I didn't know what my history was." And again, people that are a little bit older that were adopted in an earlier time where that information wasn't shared, run into this stuff all the time. But basically, it's our need to connect to history. Now, let me hope that this one works because I'm going to show you a little bit about this lady's search story.
I was brought up in a very happy household. Although I knew I was adopted, it was nothing. That was my mum. I didn't know anything else. She was my mum. Mum and dad tried for family, but wasn't successful. So they went to see the priest. And the priest put them in touch with the adoption agency in Southport. Southport, Liverpool, a lot of Irish ladies came over for the adoption. So I've made up this story that she was an Irish lady. She came over, had me, and we went back to Ireland.
What are you hoping to take from this entire experience? And if we're able to hand over information, how would that affect your life?
Probably a bit of a cliche, but it probably made me feel complete. And if my birth mum, she was alive, just, just that would be wonderful. It's quite exciting now, thinking, how is this going to go? What we're going to find out?
How often do you think about your biological mum?
I think on my birthday. I always used to think, if nothing else, she would have thought, yeah, I gave birth on that day. You would too, wouldn't you? Yeah, it would mean something.
We thought about her every single birthday.
Yeah, just quietly to myself.
So it's probably going to come as no surprise, but you come back as 93% Irish.
Wow.
And this was a period of time when it was
Mm.
incredibly difficult. Contraception was illegal in Ireland, abortion was illegal, even adoption was illegal in Ireland. And so there was about 2,000 women a year coming over from Ireland, often to places like Liverpool, because it's one of the nearest ports where they could put the children for adoption. So you were definitely not alone. So definitely your parents are Irish. So I know that you were particularly interested in finding your birth mom. We got lucky. So your birth mom is Bridget. Bridget has 2 children. So you have got younger half siblings.
Yeah. Question. I'm alive.
Yeah, she is. Your mum's still alive.
Oh, live it.
She lives in Ireland. She's in a care home. She's got dementia. But she's alive and they're looking after her. And actually, your siblings are really excited to meet you. And actually, they've written you a letter and they've asked me to pass it on.
Dear Margaret, hope this letter finds you safe and well. We are overjoyed to discover we had a sister. We are sad that our mother kept you a secret all of these years. Our mother was a very bubbly, outgoing person and loved her bright colours. She read a lot and liked the game of bingo. We are glad to hear you had a happy childhood and made a good life for yourself. We are all looking forward to meeting you. Welcome you into just beyond words. Birth mother's still alive. How amazing is that? I wanted to know if she had a good life. And I know she has, so that's great. That's really good. Spoke to my sister first. Oh, we were on the phone for, I think, nearly an hour. I said, I've always wanted a sister. And she said, I've always wanted a sister.
The thing that you need to recognize about Margaret is that she's probably in her 50s or 60s. And when she said, I think about my birth mother every year on my birthday, uh, just quietly, which means it's not pain that she was sharing with anybody. And she was able to find her birth mother. Unfortunately, her birth mother had dementia and did not recognize her. But I think just for Margaret, I think just the joy of being able to find that family connection. And having done a lot of adoption work over the years, I've I have experienced that a lot with my clients when they are finally able to reconnect with a family that they thought was gone or dead or whatever. It doesn't mean, and she said, I had a happy life. I had a good life. I grew up with my adoptive family and I was happy. She didn't say she was unhappy. She just said she always wanted to know where her mother was. Um, if you think about if if you think about what they said in that video, we're talking about a time in Ireland when adoption was illegal, contraception was illegal, abortion was illegal. I mean, these girls had no options at all. So that's why they came over on the boats into Liverpool, was the nearest port, and that was where they left the children. Um, I don't know, I'd like to say that we've come a long way. We unfortunately haven't. We've kind of reversed our course a little bit, but it is important for us to recognize that these pains just don't go away. They stay with us. They stayed with Margaret. I'm going to show you another video where the pain does stay. And that's why if you're working with adoptive parents whose children want to search for their birth parents, it's really going to be a task for you to say you need to let them and you need to help them because you don't want to leave them alone with this. This says these are reasons that adoptees do not search. I can honestly say I have never found an adoptee who had a lack of interest. If they say they have a lack of interest, it's usually something else. Actually, we did have one person here. This individual was actually a therapist with us for a while, and he was quite a bit older. And he said, I never wanted to know. And I suspected there were probably other things operating there because there are very few people that don't want to know who their core identity is, who their biological identity is, who they came from. It is not something that I have come across. Maybe some of you have, and if you have, I'd really like to hear the stories. I just have not found it. I have seen people not searching because they're loyal to their adoptive parents. And I know that to be true. I had a young man in my office who he was adopted and and again he was a social worker, so he wasn't about to ask for help, and he told me that he never tried to find his biological parents until both of his adoptive parents died, and once they died then he felt that he could look for his biological parents. But that kind of loyalty gets a little twisted, and it gets twisted when you've been given a message from your adoptive parents that they do not want you to do this. Then you're either going to not do it because you are loyal to them, or you're going to do it and you're going to do it secretively, and that's not good either. But the fear of rejection and the fear of what they're going to find, that operates in there. Because let's face it, if say you're 35 years old and you've been spending your whole life like Margaret, grieving on your birthday or saying, well, these are good adoptive parents. I like them. So what if and I love them. They've given me a good life. What if I find my mother and she's not what I envision? There is that fear, but that fear doesn't go away either. So there are a lot of healthy emotional reasons to try to determine where you came from and come to terms with it. Now, the other side of that, for those of you who um, eh, recognize that, how do we search now? We have Facebook, we have Google, we have all kinds of search engines. We've got all kinds of ways to do it. Is it possible that you're going to find something that you didn't want to find? You bet. I mean, there's a reason that a lot of these parents lost their kids to begin with, but what I've found in working with adoptees is that the fear of the unknown is a big fear. And you're almost better to have your reality. When we talk about search and reunion, this is the process that we're going to take to try to find our families. It's just a normal step. It really is a normal step. And if you can help your adoptive families understand that, life will be so much better for everybody. We have to learn who we are, don't we? And find us on Facebook. We know that you're going to find something on Facebook. Um, the problem with Facebook is that you never know what you're going to find. I have a, unfortunately, I opened up this website one day called classmates.com, and you can search for any high school, any year, and in any city, in any state in the United States, and you will find your high school class. And these people, I keep trying to unsubscribe. They hound me with things saying, do you want to know who your classmates were? And I'm thinking, okay, at my age, I don't want to know, because probably half of them are not with me anymore. But I also don't want to know who I thought was going to be the most likely to succeed and ended up in jail. I mean, we don't really need to know any of that stuff. But and those are just high school people. If you, or you're looking up an old boyfriend on Facebook and you find out that he was the most handsome guy in the world, and now he's 60 years old and he's fat and ugly, you don't need to know all that stuff. But for adoptive parents and adoptive children, you just have to be prepared for what you're going to find. You're going to find something, and you need to be prepared for what that is. And sometimes it helps to talk to other people who have learned, who have searched and have found their biological parents. How did they manage their expectations? How did they prepare for it? If you think about Margaret, she seemed equally thrilled to find out just that her mother was alive. Even though her mother wasn't going to recognize her, she seemed thrilled to find out that she had a couple of siblings, even though they were in another country, and that she was going to be able to connect with them. So there's a lot to consider when you're helping a family get involved with the search. All right, hold on a second. I think, let me go back to something here. Unfortunately, this is on our YouTube channel too, and this is, you'll have to forgive the dramatic beginning to this, because this is one of the first ones that we did, but it is one of the ones that it's one of the ones that gets looked at the most. And this is one of the very first ones that we did.
Hi, I'm Amy Iannatelli, Executive Director of Circle of Friends Services. This is Barbara DeFazio, President and CEO of Circle of Friends Services. Circle of Friends is a nonprofit organization that provides community mental health to children and families in the child welfare system. We provide outpatient counseling to both children and families. Today, we are going to talk about why adopted children will want to search for their birth parents. This is a clinical issue that we often deal with in our work, and Barbara DeFazio is going to talk a little bit about that process and then we're gonna answer some questions.
Okay, thank you, Amy. One of the things that we come across a lot in working with our children and families in the child welfare system are children who are adopted out of foster care and placed with adoptive families, sometimes at a very young age, and then get to be 12 or 13 or 14, and they suddenly want to search for their biological parents. And it is a question that comes to us as therapists a lot as to why. I adopted him when he was 2 or 3 or 4, and now he's 13. Why does he want to look for his biological family? Does it mean he doesn't love us anymore? Does it mean that our adoption has failed? Does it mean that our attachment and bonding that we worked so hard on is suddenly broken? Doesn't mean any of those things. Searching for one's biological roots is just a normal part of growing up. Think back to when you, as adopted parents, were 12 or 13 or 14, you looked for your history, you looked for your origins. You wanted to know why you had blue eyes or blonde hair. You wanted to know why you were so good at math or music or art. Was there somebody in your family that had those traits and skills? It is absolutely no different for the adoptive child, except that it takes a slightly different form. They have to search for a family outside of you. And this can be a very scary time for both children and parents alike. And that's why we wanted to talk to you about this today, to try to normalize this process, to try to tell you that there is nothing abnormal or unusual about your biological child trying to find their biological roots. Your child may not want to tell you that he is doing it or she is doing it because they may feel that it will hurt your feelings. You may feel very threatened by the fact that they are doing this, and you may feel that they don't love you anymore. None of this is true. So what do you as adoptive parents do? The day that will come that your adopted child will say to you, I want to find my biological family. I want to know where I came from. I want to know what my history is. It is your job as adoptive parents to support this process. No matter how scary you find it, you must support this process because you don't want to leave them to do it alone. Amy is going to talk a little bit about some of her experiences in working with families. But what I would say to you is that remember when you adopted a child from the foster care system, that child had to be either given away, rejected, or really let down by their biological family in order for you to come along and adopt that child. So there is a fair chance that in this search, this child will find something that will disappoint him or her, and you don't want to leave that child alone in that search. So I'm going to turn this over to Amy and let her talk a little bit about some of her experiences that she's had in working with adoptive families who grappled with this very normal but very difficult issue.
I'd first like to talk about working with very young children in this process. While very young children aren't ready to start searching for their biological family or even talking about searching for their biological family, very young children are remembering their biological family and have memories of them, and they want to be able to share them in a normal, happy way. And this is an opportunity for adoptive parents or foster parents to really embrace that, help them to maintain those memories, talk to them about their parents in a positive, loving way. It will really help them in that process. And then when they are older and ready to maybe decide that they want to search for their biological families, they'll feel way more comfortable to be able to come to their adoptive parents and share that. Now, working with older children, they're more ready to begin that search or express that need to search. And they have the typical questions that a child who is searching for their identity might have, such as, what were my biological parents like? Did they have the same likes or interests that I do? What were their talents? What did they look like? What's my medical history? All of those are questions that they need to fill in the blanks for. They have this missing information. And adoptive parents being a part of that process is really the healthiest and most positive thing that they can experience.
One of the things that we find a lot is that our adoptive children, especially when they're adopted at a very young age, can grow up with a fantasy of what that family is like. And they can say to you as the therapist or the adoptive parent, I know my mother's out there looking for me. I know I have family that's looking for me. What if they've been trying to find me all these years? Now, very often that's not the case. And very often when our adoptive children do find their biological families, there is some disappointment in the reality of what those parents have become. You have parents that are incarcerated, drug addicted, dead. This is very, very hard for children to deal with on their own. And that's why we want our parents to take part in that search.
Yeah, and if the parents are there from the beginning of that process and open to exploring those memories and talking about their parents, then when it's time for this really difficult process of maybe searching for birth parents that are not meeting that fantasy parent that that child has, the adoptive parent is there to support them, and they have a support system there for them. The other issue that I've seen is, you know, adopted children or foster children have these allegiance issues to their birth parents. And when a foster parent or an adopted parent talks negatively about their biological family, this is hurtful to the child because they come from them. They're 50% of each of those parents. And a negative comment about their biological parent is then interpreted as a negative comment about the child. So be very careful when discussing their biological parent's history. Be very age appropriate and speak about them in the most positive way possible while still being truthful.
The other thing that we have to remember is we are filming this in August of 2017. 20 years ago, when some of us began some of this work with adoptive parents, we did not have the social media that we have now. We didn't have the ability to get on Facebook or Instagram or any of the social outlets and search for people. So think about a small experience that you might have for trying to find someone that you went to high school with, and you find something less than desirable on Facebook about that person. That might be just something curious for you. For our kids, they have the very strong social media tools to go do this, whether you support them or whether you don't. So it's very, very important that you recognize that the search is going to happen. There are very few kids who don't want to search for their parents and their biological parents. It's just a normal part of the lifelong adoptive process. So join your child in the search as a family. Do this together. Amy and I have done a lot of years in this field, and we guarantee you that it will have a much better outcome if you join them, if you help them, and if you do this together as a family.
The positive message that I send to children and to parents and to you is that there is room in their heart for everybody. I know this can be a very threatening process, but there is room in their heart for everybody.
Thank you for listening. We hope that this has been helpful to you, and we hope to make you aware that this is normal. This is a normal part of the adoption process, and you'll get through it and you'll be stronger for it as a family. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll spare you the dramatic ending. We have dramatic beginnings and we have dramatic endings. And in the beginning, we did this little infomercial at the beginning of every one of these where we talked about what Circle of Friends was. And now, because again, we started these a few years ago, and I look back on them and I think, oh my gosh, we don't have to tell them every single time who we are and what we're doing, but we did. So I think because, see what time it is. All right. Why don't we take a little break here? It's 11:20. If you guys can come back at 10 of 12, we can do the rest of this and get you out of here. How does that sound? Okay.